or even to look at the crucial moments in the history of our literature. So what I'm trying to do is certainly to look at certain critical moments in the evolution of Indian writing, and through that also to convey to you the secular and composite nature of the kind of culture, of the kind of literary culture that India has had and India still hopes to continue with, despite the many challenges that obviously this culture is facing from various quarters. So this is a poem on Gandhi. I have two poems on Gandhi, and of which I am reading one called Gandhi and Poetry. This is originally written in Malayalam, and this is a translation. One day, a lean poem reached Gandhi's ashram to have a glimpse of the man. Gandhi, spinning away his thread towards Ram, took no notice of the poem, waiting at his door, ashamed of not being a bhajan. The poem now cleared his throat, and Gandhi glanced at him sideways through those glasses that had seen hell. "Have you ever spun thread?" he asked. "Ever pulled a scavenger's cart? Ever stood the smoke of an early morning kitchen? Have you ever starved?" The poem said, "I was born in the woods, in a hunter's mouth. A fisherman brought me up in a cottage." There are veiled references to Vyasa and Valmiki and Vyasa there. "Yet I know no work, I only sing. First I sang in the courts, then I was plump and handsome. But am on the streets now, half starved." "That's better," Gandhi said with a sly smile. "But you must give up this habit of speaking in Sanskrit at times. Go to the fields, listen to the peasants' speech." The poem turned into a grain and lay waiting in the fields for the tiller to come and upturn the virgin soil, moist with new rain. But you must give up this habit of speaking in Sanskrit at times. Go to the fields, listen to the peasants' speech. The poem turned into a grain and lay waiting in the fields for the tiller to come and upturn the virgin soil, moist with new rain. Maybe after the poem I will tell you a story also, which will in some way be an introduction to the kind of diversity that we are trying to deal with here whenever we discuss the literature of India, written in so many languages and produced by so many different kinds of movements, different classes, different people coming from different castes and religions. This story is about Ramayana. This is a folk tale which A.K. Ramanujan has retold. A folk tale that is available in the Kannada folk tradition and also in several others, especially in the tribal traditions of Ramayana, like the Bhili and the Santali traditions, and also in many traditions outside, like the Laotian, for example, or the Philippine, the Indonesian, the Malaysian, the Cambodian. In all these traditions, this story is available. One day, Rama loses one of his rings, actually the ring on his index finger. The ring drops and disappears through a hole in the earth, and he sends Hanuman in search of the ring. Hanuman goes to the netherworld. He meets the king of the spirits in the netherworld and tells him well, this has happened, I need Rama's ring. And the king of spirits in the netherworld offers him a big platter full of rings, and he tells Hanuman, well, these are all Rama's rings. You can choose your Rama's rings. Indian writing. So Ramayana and Mahabharata have been two of the major Indian literary traditions on which a lot of Indian literature is based. Actually, almost up to the 19th century, most of Indian literature, Indian poetry in particular, was a kind of they were full of adaptations of stories, episodes from Ramayana, and if you look at Sanskrit literature and other language literatures, they were adaptations, interpretations, retellings, paraphrasings, explanations of the various episodes in these two epics. But we need not forget that there have been other epics which have come from the marginalized traditions. There are certainly these epics have, Ramayana and Mahabharata have tribal versions, but then there are also tribal epics. There are quite a few which have not yet been translated into many of the modern languages, except a few like Malle Madeshwara, an oral epic, the Kannada region. So there are several epics. There is a whole parallel tradition of epics of the marginalized communities in India, which is something that perhaps we still need to look into. And saying that, I would certainly claim that Indian literature, like any other literature, actually began with the tribal lore, the tribal stories, the tribal songs, which were sometimes songs about seasons and about nature. Sometimes they were ritual songs sung during different occasions like childbirth or the death of a person, and of course songs of marriage, songs related to work, songs of harvest, and various kinds of songs sung during hard work to ease the toil. So in fact, the roots of our literature, like the roots of all literatures, lie in the literature of the tribal people who later, of course, got marginalized in a geographical sense and also in a deeper symbolic sense. But that is where I think we need to look for the roots of our literature. So Rig Veda and the other three Vedas form another chapter, in fact, of in the evolution of Indian literature. There is also an invisible chapter which is called Sainthav literature. Invisible because the Indus Valley script is yet to be deciphered, and hence we really do not know the nature of the literature that existed in the times of the Indus Valley civilization. We know a lot about their architecture, all those visible things in concrete, but then we do not know much about the writing, because the writing is, even though some have claimed they have deciphered it, no kind of deciphering has been accepted by scholars universally. And so we have originally we have the tribal lore, we have Sainthav literature, then we have the Vedas and the Upanishads, again tribal literature, great poetry, which also has its own message of egalitarianism if you read it properly, because the ultimate prayer you hear from that is a prayer for peace, a prayer for the peace not only of human beings but of all. There is the great Vedic prayer of peace for not only man, peace for the animals, peace for the vanaspati, that is peace for the plants, peace for the entire nature, the whole cosmos. And you find that in the Upanishads also, even the concept of God. I cannot use the word God because that brings a lot of Western suggestions associated with the word God, because the concept of Brahma, for example, cannot be really equated with the concept of a God who had, for example, made a man in his own image. Instead, it is I think even a non-believer or a skeptic can very well accept this kind of a concept of ultimate energy, or what you may imagine to be the originary, or the kind of a force. It could very well be a physical and material force which is yet to be explained, which holds the entire universe together. Because it is often explained, as you know, in the negative terms in the Upanishads, as in the Keno Upanishad, na tatra chakshur gacchadi, na vag gacchadi, na mana, na vitmo, na vijanimo, yathaita danushishyat. You can guess the meaning. Na tatra chakshur gacchadi, eyes do not go there. Na vag gacchadi, word does not go there. In the sense, you cannot explain it in words, you cannot see it. Na vitmo, you cannot learn it. Na vijanimo, you cannot teach it as it is to the disciples. Yathai tadanu shishyat. So often this force is explained in a kind of negative terms, and one can very well explain Brahma as the ultimate mystery that seems to illumine the entire universe. So what I mean to say is that this is again a very broad kind of concept, and not the concept of somebody sitting in a particular place and controlling us and telling us what is good and what is bad for us, but it is another kind of concept of a kind of primal energy, or the basic and fundamental dynamism of the entire universe. So that again, what I wanted to say was that again is a kind of ultimately secular concept. It is not the concept of a god that belongs to a particular religion and commanding that you believe me, and if you don't believe me you are damned, like many gods have begun to do these days. But instead this is a completely non-attached source of energy, dynamism and life. And then we have this period of what you call the epics, about which I just made some mention, especially the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, which I again said are traditions and not really single texts. And around that time also the folk tales get collected. You know, that is why we have the Panchatantra, the Brihat Katha, we have the Brihat Katha Manjari, we have the Katha Sarit Sagar. So there are quite a few folk tale collections done by different scholars, like Somadeva doing Panchatantra, or Gunatya doing Brihat Katha, or Somadeva again collecting stories under the title Katha Sarit Sagar. And there is Vasudeva Hindi, a collection of Jain tales, and we have the Jataka tales of the Buddhist stories. So we have a period where folk tales get collected, and then the period of the epics, whose stories also probably have come from folk sources. That is what many scholars say, including the story, the various episodes in the Mahabharata. They seem to have come from the stories about the Kuru clan, about the Puru clan, and the Naga clan. From these three, almost all the episodes come from the stories around these clans, which might already have been in existence when Mahabharata got sung or written for the first time. For the first time, I said, because it has been now clearly proved that it was not a text written by a particular writer called Vyasa. Vyasa is an imaginary name, and perhaps there are so many Vyasas, and because we have already found the 8,000 verse original Mahabharata from Hastinapura, and now it has 24,000 verses. So many things, so many stories got added through generations, through centuries perhaps. Mahabharata evolved into its present form, and it took a lot of stories from what was happening all around, and also from the entire oral tradition. And so again, that is a text that got evolved over time. Then you have a period of Sanskrit literature, where Sanskrit literature becomes dominant. One can place it somewhere between the 3rd and the 14th centuries AD, because Jayadeva's Gita Govinda was perhaps the last most important text that this tradition produced. Well, again, so it produced all those paradigmatic poets like Kalidasa, who was also a playwright, as you know, and Bhasa, another great dramatist, and Bhavabhudi, and the whole well-known canonized Sanskrit tradition. I said canonized tradition because there are also other texts. You have Sudraga's Mritchakadiga, for example. Mritchakadiga dealing with the ordinary people's lives and not with the lives of kings and queens. And you have poets like Yogeshwara, rarely translated, who spoke about the peasants and the ordinary people of the time. So what I wanted to say was Sanskrit again had a parallel tradition, a tradition of speaking about the lives of common people, ordinary people. It is not, often it is believed that all the writers dealt with the lives of kings and princes and princesses, not exactly so. But that was a time when indeed the classes were beginning to emerge, the Varnas were emerging, and even in Kalidasa's Shakuntala, from the very language, you know that he was using various kinds of registers for the dialogues delivered by different characters. The women, because it was a patriarchal society, so women and servants use a kind of Prakrit or sometimes Paishachi, while the kings and princes speak in a more refined kind of language, Sanskrit, which is a kind of reflection in language of the societal ideology that dominated in the time, and also Kalidasa's treatment of Shakuntala. Again, I am not going into the detail. Many of you might have come across Romila Thapar's interesting book on Shakuntala, where she has contrast Shakuntala of Mahabharata. I mean, let us call it Vyasa's Mahabharata for the time being, whoever Vyasa is and how many Vyasas there are. Vyasa's Mahabharata and Kalidasa's Shakuntala. And she has shown beautifully and with plenty of evidences, especially from the history of the reception of Shakuntala in the West, that how the independent woman in Mahabharata, Shakuntala was a free, independent woman, full of self-assertion, taking her own decisions, becomes in Kalidasa a coy woman, very vulnerable, unable to decide herself, extremely fragile, fickle, a beautiful woman who would turn into water if you touch her. That kind of, like the Victorian idea of that pallid, bloodless beauty. And this, Romila Thapar argues convincingly, is because of the kind of change in the lives of women and the conception about women that had come over the ages between the time Mahabharata was conceived and Kalidasa's Shakuntala got written. And she has also beautifully narrated how the Western reception of Kalidasa's Shakuntala, because they made much of Kalidasa's Shakuntala, all those great quotations of Max Muller and the various particularly German scholars and a few French scholars who showed Shakuntalam to be the greatest and the most magnificent text that has ever been produced in India. It was because it's so this image of Shakuntala fitted so well with their Orientalist understanding of the East. Well, again, I am not going to explain in detail the Orientalist ideology. Let me simplify it. Of course, it is a bad simplification. Like, imagine an India of sannyasins and snake charmers and beautiful women. Well, to make it simple. Well, that kind of, essentially, that is the kind of what you call Orientalism, on which Edward Said has written so extensively, which revolutionized the entire understanding or our understanding of our own literature and the Western literature and thought. So that was a kind of prejudice, because there was an India out there, very wild, full of savages, and then full of these beautiful, vulnerable women, and indeed full of snake charmers and mystics and yogis. That the spiritual India, which had nothing to do perhaps with the real India, where There were other kinds of people, ordinary people, workers, people who, people who were inventing things, discovering things. Where there was, of course, some sciences like metallurgy and engineering developed so well. So there is the real India. But then this was the kind of concept, and the image of Shakuntala that Kalidasa produced fitted so well with this Orientalist idea, because here was this soft, tender, vulnerable woman somewhere in the forest, brought up by Kanwa, and so weak that when the king comes and asks for her hand, she just falls for him. So so what I wanted to say was, even behind the literary text, there is always a kind of ideological control. Not that the author himself or herself should be conscious of that, but then there are various kinds of ideologies in the society working behind even literary text, the writing of text, and more than that, the reading of text, because you read a text from a particular kind of perspective, and this perspective always has very deep social, even political implication. It is quite possible that apparently the same text, in fact there is no sameness in the text. Again, this is the post-structuralist area of literary theory into which I am not venturing now. So there is no text out there. It is, in fact, in reading you produce text, and the way you read has a lot to do with the nature of the kind of text that you produce from a particular book. And so that is why today we have feminist readings, we have Marxist readings, we have readings from the margins, as Derrida was trying to do. So various kinds of readings of the same kind of text, where sometimes you can destroy the text, in the sense, I should use the word, unfortunately, deconstruct the text, to use Derrida's term, where you read it through the margins, and you find the kind of conflicts within, and using those conflicts explore the main argument of the text. This is in simple terms the strategy of reading that Derrida uses when he reads Lévi-Strauss or Nietzsche or Rousseau. What I mean to say, there are possibilities of multiple reading, just as there are possibilities of writing in different ways on the same subject, on the same situation. There are ways and ways of looking at social events and contexts, and there are ways and ways of reading these texts too from different points of view. So there was, I was speaking about Sanskrit literature. So there was a high period of Sanskrit literature, which also, however, as I said, produced a parallel text about the ordinary people. And along with that, we had Buddhist and Jain texts like Ashokosha's Buddha Charita, to take just one example. These texts mainly dealt with the life of Buddha or the life of Mahavira in the case of Jain texts, and they were written mostly in Pali or Prakrit and Abhapramsha. India has 15 scripts, by the way, and most of them are derived from the original script called Brahmi script. So how many languages we have, nobody knows, because if you will go mad if you look at the various kinds of census we had, or if Grierson speaks of 1654 languages, and the Anthropological Survey speaks of 325 languages, and then the 1964 census has another number of mother tongues and all that. But all these just to show that we have several languages and dialects, and we have not yet exactly been able to define, and there is no need to define the difference between a language and a dialect. There is no need, because there is this famous saying that when a dialect gets an army and a government, it becomes a language. So that is how you find under pressure. Bodo and Santali have now joined the 8th schedule of the Indian Constitution after a lot of struggle. and when people's voices were raised, no government could resist that, and so they are in the 8th schedule. But there are other languages like Bhojpuri, which is spoken perhaps more by more people than Bodo. But the question is how the people are able to articulate their demands, and how it happens to be heard in the public sphere. So this variety of languages, by the way, is often considered, at least the British considered a kind of obstacle. If you look at various kinds of British texts on India, because they found it extremely difficult to understand this country with so many languages, so many kinds of races and classes and castes, and this immense diversity was something they found difficult because they wanted to rule us. But not difficult for us who live in India, because we have lived with it and we enjoy this diversity. Every moment we enjoy this diversity. So many religions, various kinds of belief systems, so many tribes, and people coming from different kinds of backgrounds. So all these have in fact enriched India's literature. So we need not look at it from the Western man's point of view, looking at it as a kind of obstacle to unity. In fact, that is the real source of the richness and abundance of India's literature, India's culture. These various perspectives, different worldviews, and our democracy has certainly to be founded on this plurality, on this great, inconquerable, and almost inexplicable diversity of worldviews and of ways of life, ways of looking at things, and ways of living and of culture. And so we need to celebrate. This is what I always say. We need to celebrate this plurality, celebrate this diversity, and not to turn differences into platforms of battle, of a conflict. Instead, here is a great diversity which is to be enjoyed, because there is a festival. India, the whole of India is that way, a kind of festival of diversity, diverse cultures, a festival of so many languages and different kinds of literature. So along with Sanskrit, Jain and Buddhist literatures, we had also the Sangam literature in the south, in not the present Tamil Nadu, what was the Tamil area at that time, which also included a lot of parts of today's Kerala, because now we always think of the boundaries of states, which is actually retrospectively all these do not seem to stand any chance of scientific scrutiny, because these were boundaries which we ourselves much later made. But then there was a large area where Tamil was spoken, and that was where Ilango Adigal was born, and masterpieces like Shilapadigar. So when we speak of the epic tradition, there are Tamil epics too, like Manimegalai and Shilapadigaram, which deals with the revenge of a woman called Kannagi, whose husband, whose husband Kovalan was accused of stealing the queen's anklet, while actually he had sold his own wife's anklet when he was passing through bad days in Madurai, and so he was sentenced to death because it was supposed that he had stolen the king, because it looked very much like the queen's anklet. But after he was killed, it was discovered when the goldsmith or whoever broke the anklet, they found they contained different kinds of stones, and they knew, well, this was not the queen's, and the king regretted. But more than that, Kannagi became angry at this total abuse of power, and it is said that she threw her breasts at the city of Madurai, and the whole city burned. So that way it is a woman's text. I mean, ultimately declaring the power of the woman against injustice and oppression. So that was a time when a lot of great poetry got written in Tamil. Some about domestic life and love, and some about social life, about kings and wars. So they are called Aham poems, Agam poems, poems of the the interior, and Puram poems, poems of the exterior. That is, poems about love, domesticity, and relationships, and poems about society and politics. And then this period is followed by what I would generally call the period of Bhakti and Sufi literatures. One can say almost from the 7th to the 19th century, you find a continuity of the tradition of what can generally be called devotional poetry, which is either Bhakti poetry or Sufi poetry. Again, I would consider this to be a very crucial period in the history of Indian literature, because this was the time when Indian society really began to be secularized. This was the time when bridges were being built across religions, across communities, across languages, because many of these Bhakti poets wrote. Actually, they did not write. They composed, they chanted, they composed in different languages. Like Kabir himself, Kabir has songs in Hindi and also in Lahudi and in Punjabi, Lahudi, which is supposed to be a dialect. And so Guru Nanak, and so Meera, because Meera is claimed by Hindi, she composed in Braj, and also by Gujarati, because she had Gujarati songs, and Braj and Gujarati and Rajasthani. So they almost unconsciously traveled from one language to another. When they moved from one area to another, they also moved into the other language, almost unconsciously. They did not know they were using another language because it was so natural for them. And the Bhakti, if there is something common to the entire tradition, because the tradition begins in Tamil with the old Tamil Shaivites of the 7th century, and if you look at the composition of the Tamil Shaivites in terms of class, most of them, almost all of them, were craftsmen. They were ordinary peasants, small merchants like peddlers, weavers, people who came from the lowliest of the lowly, or who were considered untouchable in the so-called hierarchy of caste. So and this defined, in fact, the nature of devotion expressed through Bhakti poetry, because this was something what I would call religion from below. Or even, why religion? I would better call it spirituality from below, because they often questioned religion in its status quo, in its existing forms, because they interrogated rituals. They interrogated a lot of superstition and blind beliefs. Many of them rejected the worship of idols. Even Kabir was for a kind of nirgun of Brahma without qualities, and which was not concrete and which could not be worshipped or idolized in stone. And so that was one reason why it was a kind of people's religion. And secondly, as I said, that these poets were the first to establish power of the languages of India after the hegemony of a Sanskrit. Very much like the Latin scholarship was Latin scholarship and Latin poetry both got absorbed into what is called Vulgate, and modern European languages emerged. Just like that, Indian languages absorbed whatever was good and useful in Sanskrit, because they translated, adapted, interpreted, and through that, whatever was best in Sanskrit was brought into the Indian languages, and through that, Indian languages emancipated themselves also from the hegemony of Sanskrit. When I make my Gandhi say, stop speaking in Sanskrit, it is not because I have any hatred for Sanskrit. I respect it as a very important and a very major language of India. And often you need to learn that to know our own past. But there, of course, I am using it in another sense. So don't use the language of the ruler. Don't use the language of hegemony. Use the language of earth, the language spoken by the common people, the day-to-day language. And the day-to-day languages of the common people really got empowered during the Bhakti period. And many of the Bhakti poets are called the fathers of their languages, and the people who really created the languages. In Malayalam, for example, example, which is my mother tongue, Ezhuthachan, who wrote the Ramayana, is called the father of Malayalam because he created a proper Malayalam style, which is still actually the style of Malayalam, with a proper mixture of Dravidian words and Sanskrit words and words derived from various other sources. Because the language itself has borrowed from Dutch and Portuguese and French and Arabic. There is a whole variety of Malayalam called Arabic Malayalam, and that is how many of our languages have grown, by the way, because our languages are also in that sense deeply composite. And so every kind of fundamentalism is impossible. If you really look at the composition of our society, if you really look at our spiritual traditions, if you really look at our languages, it is impossible to be a religious fundamentalist or a linguistic fundamentalist or an ethnic fundamentalist, because nobody can claim to belong to any kind of pure race. And Romila Thapar, in her last book on Aryans, has so convincingly argued that there is no race called Aryans. These are two language groups: people who spoke the Aryan languages and people who spoke the Dravidian languages. And so all the talk about Dravidians and Aryans and the fight between them, and whether Aryans were here or whether Aryans came from abroad, so these questions become irrelevant if you just look at them as language groups and people speaking different kinds of languages. And no one today can claim to be an Aryan or a Dravid anyway in any pure sense, because there has been so much of mixing of races, fortunately, in India, so that we don't stand by some kind of ethnic anthropological purity in spite of Levi-Strauss. So we need to understand that we are a mixed race, and we speak various kinds of languages, and all these languages are also mixtures of words and structures which have come from several other languages. So Bhakti tradition established these languages, really empowered them, and that is the second radical aspect of Bhakti. And thirdly, it did not accept any kind of hierarchy, the caste hierarchy or the hegemony of Brahmin or the priestly class, because they did not need priests at all, because the Bhakti poets and the Sufi poets believed in talking directly to God. So then making priesthood completely irrelevant. If you can directly talk to God, you don't need a priest. And so they decided to do away with the need for priesthood at all, and all of them rejected the caste and rejected the power of money, rejected various forms of earthly power. In fact, I wanted to read samples of, I don't have the time, samples of texts from Basava and Akka Mahadevi and Lalded and Kabir and Meera and various kinds of poets from different linguistic traditions, Tukaram, Namdev. So you name them. There are hundreds of Bhakti poets, and then you have Shah Abdul Latif and Bulle Shah, and several poets of the Sufi tradition who again were liberated and who also spoke against the narrow-minded priesthood of the times that existed in Islam, and who also stood for a kind of liberated spirituality, and who took a lot from their own environment and the spiritual traditions they found in their own countries. There are various kinds of Sufi traditions and Sufi thoughts, again, into which I am not going, right from the Iranian tradition to the Punjabi Sufism. But then all the Sufis had this in common. They also, very much like the Bhakti poets, rejected the externals of religion, rituals and superstitions and various forms of worship which had come into the religion, and so they were trying to create an essential kind of spiritual tradition without the paraphernalia that made which were really redundant, and that made religion so heavy with all kinds of beliefs and rituals. So in creating the languages and empowering them, in fighting the caste system and various kinds of hierarchies in the society and various kinds of hegemonies, in standing with the poorest and the most marginalized people and trying to voice their concerns through poetry, in opposing earthly power, royal power. You know how Kabir refused to go to the king's court when he was invited, and he was beaten up in the marketplace. But then Kabir stood there and suffered it because he said, I have only one king and he is not here in this earth. So that kind of assertion, which was a form of profound spiritual rebellion, was the central characteristic of Bhakti and Sufi poetry. Don't think I am trying to make it look like a monolith. No, there were different streams of thought. I have written elaborately on all these different streams of thought, different ways of looking at relationships, looking at religion, and there were some at least who would accept Chadurvarnya also, like Tulsidas, for example. So one can find different kinds of traditions within the Bhakti and Sufi traditions, but there are, generally speaking, this was to say, it was essentially a kind of subaltern expression of spirituality which empowered languages and empowered the marginalized ultimately. I would say that all the later developments in Indian literature come from or are rooted in that egalitarian ideal, the ideal of the composite society, the ideal where the ordinary man is the hero and day-to-day life is the theme that was developed during the Bhakti and Sufi period. From that comes a Subramanya Bharati or a Vallatol or a Sumitranandan Pant, all those people who stood with the powers of emancipation in the colonial days. From that come the progressive writers like Premchand or Mulk Raj Anand or Ali Sardar Jafri or various or Tagadi Shivashankar Pillai or Vaikam Muhammad Bashir. You name them, and all of them come again from this kind of a tradition of interrogation, a tradition of questioning power in various ways. And during the progressive time, there was a kind of, in fact, one could say it was Marxism coalesced into Gandhism, because they were Gandhians at the same time, Gandhians with a kind of class perspective, as was the case, for example, with someone like Premchand, who would learn from both the traditions. And this was true even to a great extent of Tagore, of Nazrul Islam, of various poets and fiction writers of the time, because by the time prose had come up and prose had produced various genres, the novel, the short story, which were in fact a kind of, I would say, combinations of our own narrative traditions with what we learned from the West. It is not right to say that novel or short story came entirely from the West. Indeed, where the Western models had inspired the early writers, but then we had our own narrative traditions, right from the Vikramaditya tales and the Panchatantra tales. We had our own narrative traditions, and these narrative traditions are also, and our narrative strategies were made use of in our early novels and short stories. So they were products of a kind of dialogue between our culture and the culture from the West, and again the whole movement that we have come to call modernism of the 50s and 60s. I'm trying to really excuse what we call modernism, which was actually a kind of critique of Western modernity. There are various ways of looking at modernism, I know, but I would look at it, I would look at the central axis of modernism to be a kind of a critique it was developing. It was called modernist literature, but actually it was a critique of the Western kind of modernity, because the development of the ugly cities, the class differences which were increasing day by day, the alienation and the solitude that the people in the city really felt, their feeling of getting uprooted from their villages and their traditions, the whole trauma, the whole tension, the whole agony and anguish, these came to be expressed in the literature of the 60s, right from take B.S. Martekar or take Gajanan Madhav Muktibodh in Hindi, take Ayyappa Panikar or Gopalakrishna Adiga or Sri Sri or Ajanta or Kana Subramaniam in the south. So and take the various modern fiction writers. So most of them have tried to express this kind of a critique of what we call colonial modernity. They were trying to develop a critique in their own way. One may criticize their way of looking at things, but they were trying to develop a critique of colonial modernity. Dalits could not represent themselves in their literature, because now that, for example, Dalits are becoming literate and many of them have the essential genius, creative genius needed for literature and other arts, they say, now you have told our story so far, thank you very much, but now allow us to speak. We are here to speak about ourselves, and you can never completely understand the pang we went through over 3,000 years of discrimination and marginalization. And so you have Lakshman Mane or Lakshman Gaikwad or Sharan Kumar Limbale in Marathi coming up with moving autobiographies and accounts of the lives of the Dalits. And you have someone like Joseph McQuan, the novelist, or Joseph McQuan, the poet in Gujarati, and someone like Bama, a novelist in Tamil, and all over. I'm not going into examples. There are hundreds of Dalit writers like Om Prakash Valmiki in Hindi, if you want an example here. So there are quite a lot of writers in different languages, Dalit writers who are coming out in a sense. I mean, they are trying to say who they are and what they were and what they really want to be. And this is not merely, don't think I am reducing literature to sociology. No, they have also created a new language for literature. A language that comes from the slums, a language that is the raw language used in the daily life on the street, and that way they have actually questioned the language of canonical literature, and questioned the canon itself, because they say now you have to alter your canon or change your standards, change your ways of looking at society. And this is exactly what our women writers are also trying to say from a gender perspective, because they are trying to question patriarchy and the stamp of patriarchy in domestic life, in public life, and in language itself, because languages, even in grammar you will find those the stamps and seals of patriarchy. And so we have scores of women writers, right from Kamala Das and Navani, that they have sent to Kurutulin Haidar, Ismat Chukta, even a more powerful writer, who are questioning the rules set by patriarchy for the game of life, and who are trying to create their own rules and creating a language of desire, a language around the body, a language of emancipation, a language of resistance against every form of patriarchy. And this again you find among the Adivasis, or the tribal people of India, because tribal people are also getting empowered, and they have produced, different tribes have also produced, they have of course a great oral tradition, but now they are also producing literature of high quality, totally different from the mainstream literature in their concerns, in their great concern for nature. I have lived with the Bhils in Gujarat for some time, and I know even before milking a cow, the Bhil apologizes to the mother cow and says, "I'm sorry, I have to take some milk, I know it belongs to you." And before plucking fruits from the trees, they apologize to the tree, because I know I am not supposed to use this fruit, but please, I have no choice. And Can you imagine a more civilized, a more cultured understanding of the universe? So there are these positive values that the tribal people are trying to voice through their literature. Of course, there is anger against their marginalization, but there is also a positive assertion of the values of their life, like the Dalits also are doing now in the second generation and third generation Dalit writing. The first generation Dalit writing was mainly a writing of anger, but now there is a positive writing speaking about the values of neighborhood, the love, the fraternity, the whole positive aspect of the community life of the Dalits. So Dalit writing, women's writing, tribal writing, writing by those who want to reconnect man and nature, and who are concerned with the terrible ecological damage that the greed of capitalism has brought into the world. So those people concerned with the ecology, and people who are trying to fight globalization and the terrible cultural amnesia it is trying to impose on the third world people, and the kind of imposition of various kinds of cultures from outside, making us forget our own big and little traditions, and killing our languages and turning us more and more monolingual. So there are writers who are protesting against globalization, protesting against the hegemony of the market that is like a a new King Midas that turns everything it touches into a commodity. Even poetry, once the market touches, becomes a commodity, and paintings, as you know, are fast becoming commodities. And instead of the painters deciding what they should paint, the market will tell them what sells best and what. So, and I'm not saying that all painters have succumbed to this, but then there is this terrible kind of cyclope, this temptation outside the market, trying to control everything, control tastes, and control even creativity. So these are the monsters, and there is of course communalism in its various kinds of forms, whose explosions we keep seeing all around us, that creates an other, and then accuses that other as the very source of every evil, and then seeks reasons to destroy the other without realizing that the other is oneself, and there is absolutely no conflict between one's self and the other. So we need to redefine the borders between the self and the other. We need to resist the oppressive aspects of globalization and communalism, and the kind of hegemony that the market is trying to have over everything in our life, including our culture. We need to resist the death of our languages and the disempowerment of our regional languages and literatures. So we need, in fact, to revive and protect this essentially composite, essentially secular culture which has defined Indian literature over the ages. Thank you.